Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today's video is on the nature of the coastline. The learning outcomes of today's video is to look into the formation of waves and wave speed. We're going to define spring and neap tides. We'll define longshore currents. And then finally, we're going to evaluate the different types of beaches we're going to expect at different types of tectonic boundaries, whether they be active or passive margins. So what is a wave? A wave is a propagation of energy through a medium. And so in this case, we're looking at the movement of energy through water. And so a water wave has a wavelength, which is the length between two peaks. We have wave height, which is the height of that peak. And then there's a wave period, which is the speed of that peak that it passes over a certain point. Open water waves are waves in water that's so far away from any coast or the bottom that it's sort of behaving as though it's suspended in a vacuum. We're only looking at the behavior of the water and not other things acting on that water. Open water waves move in a circular motion. Actually, they're not moving in a really profound like current at the top or wave speed. They're just circulating in these things called eddies. So as wind blows over the water surface, it pulls some of that water that it touches on the water surface with it. So that starts your movement, and then eventually that dives down and starts pulling things with it. So that water that's being pulled is pulling the water below it a little bit and pulling the water below it a little bit more. And so those start making these eddies, and these eddies then turn water into eddies below it, and they'll below it and below it until it hits down to the bottom of the water column. And it gets smaller and smaller each time, and eventually it stops. At the very bottom of the deep ocean, we're not feeling the movement of these waves that are happening at the surface, and that's because of these frictional losses that happens with each eddy moving. When waves start approaching our shoreline, they start feeling the bottom, and that's what's developing our wave speed, our current towards the shore. And so think of it like someone kicking out your feet out from under you as you're running. This water is behaving in the same way that it does in the open ocean. It's starting to move with the wind, but then the frictional forces basically truncate that back speed. And so it's moving forward, and then the friction cuts it back. And so it's just really plowing forward now towards the shoreline because of this frictional forces acting in the opposite direction. Eventually, it becomes so powerful, those frictional forces become so powerful that the water over topples onto itself. The wave topples over, and that is called a breaker or a break. And that line that occurs at is called our break line. So that's when waves start to over topple, and you get the surfing waves, you get sort of the white foamy waves that we aren't seeing out into the ocean. The shoreline is defined as where the water meets the land, and that changes throughout different parts of the day based off of the tides. So in the open ocean, we have these turbulent eddies of water. The friction from the bottom is what's causing the overtopping of waves and actually the strong movement of water toward shore. Our tides, as opposed to waves, they move in waves, but they are periodic rises and fall of the water level as a result of the sun and the moon pulling on the water on the Earth's surface. The ocean in areas closest to the sun and the moon bulges to those regions and pulls a bit more water towards the sun and the moon, and that's what each tide is representing. So when we have a spring tide, the sun and the moon are aligned more so. They're constructively interfering in their tides, and they're ending up in creating a larger tide magnitude. Whereas a neap tide, they're destructively interfering, they're conflicting with each other, and they're actually subtracting from each other, creating a small tide. Here we have some information about Santa Cruz's tide for the next couple days. You can see the spring tide is occurring at about midnight tonight, and it's going to be 4.49 feet in height. The neap tide is like 3.8. And so it sort of oscillates between those two. You actually get four different types of tides based off of the movement and the constructive and destructive interference of the sun and the moon. So what you need to know about tides is that the sun is pulling water in one direction, the moon is pulling water in another direction. That's moving around and dropping and creating that wave motion. Tides, the movement of the tides, and so sometimes those tides constructively interfere with each other or destructively interfere with each other. And now I want to talk about longshore current, which is the movement of water that governs the movement of sediment, which is really important. Coastal erosion and accretion is really crucial for coastal communities. This is the current that is parallel to the shoreline. So here we have these blue arrows, which represents our actual wave direction. And waves rarely ever hit the beach perpendicularly or parallel with the beach line. They're hitting the beach at some angle. And so that can be split up into a perpendicular wave direction, the wave approach, and a longshore current. That's a wave speed that is parallel and acting on the beach in a parallel direction. You can calculate that with trigonometry and the angle of approach of your waves. This is what's moving sediment down the coastline. That's called littoral drift. So over time, sediment actually moves across an entire coastline. And so you can track the movement of sediment as you know the velocity and magnitude of the longshore current. The littoral, if you're not familiar, is a region of a water body that gets sun to its very bottom. Lakes have littoral zones, rivers have littoral zones, the ocean has a littoral zone. And so that's where the water is shallow enough to allow light all the way to its bottom. And so that's why this is called littoral drift, because it's sediment drift happening in the littoral zone. The pelagic is a region of water, the water body where the sun doesn't reach the bottom. And so you may be familiar with some fishing brands that are called pelagic, and that is sort of talking about fishing in the open ocean, because once you get far enough out, the sun does not make it all the way to the bottom, and it creates the zone of the whole body of water that we call the pelagic zone. And so active margins, the tectonic activity you experience on a coastline will tell you what kind of beach you would expect or what kind of landforms to expect in that area. A coastline on an active plate boundary, that's one that's actively moving relative to each other, like in different directions. These typically have cliffs on their edge. They have a narrow continental shelf. So that is, once you move far enough off the shoreline, it drops down into our abyssal plain. And so that continental shelf is not very wide. It doesn't go on for very many miles off the shoreline. And so that's what you see here in Santa Cruz. This is a photo of the cliffs along the one, which is very typical of a coastline on an active margin. On a passive margin, this is a beach that's on a coastline that's on a passive plate boundary. There's not lots of movement relative to each other's plate. These produce more gently sloping beaches and a much wider beach width. Our active margins produce a smaller beach, whereas a passive margin usually produces a lot broader of a beach because our continental shelf is a lot longer. It goes on for a lot further offshore, and so it really makes for a nice, gently sloping, wide beach. And so that concludes our video for today. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Take care.